But yeah, as you can see on the screen, I wanted to let you all know that we are taking applications for our next round of organizers. Advocates for Youth works with a wide range of youth activists across the country. We have a lot of different programs. If you follow that bit.ly-afy-programs, you can find more information. Our applications are open until July 1st, so take a look, go ahead and apply, let your friends know, and I'm going to tell you all a bit more about it here today before we get started. So you might be wondering, what is Advocates for Youth? Who are you guys? Basically, we are a nonprofit. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we train youth activists ages 14 to 24 to become intersectional organizers in their community. And we focus on sexual health and reproductive rights and justice. Ultimately, we believe that young people should be leaders and are leaders in our communities, that there's a wide range of issues that we talk about and focus on. Some of that is like sex ed, that we should have sex ed, it should be inclusive and honest, that LGBTQ youth deserve supportive environments, that reproductive justice is a part of our collective liberation, that we must end HIV discrimination, that Black Lives Matter, that there should be no Muslim ban, and that everyone deserves to be free from gender-based violence. And basically how we do this is we train a wide range of folks. We train educators, physicians, parents, and other adults on how to be better. We also have digital projects like our Muslim And campaign, our Abortion Out Loud campaign, My Story Out Loud, and we use storytelling to shift our culture. And then we also partner with brands to educate students about a wide range of things like contraception. And we have these youth activist councils that are open for you all to apply to. And there's like a lot of different kinds. There's either some identity-based ones or issue-based ones. Some of our identity-based councils are ones like the Muslim Youth Leadership Council, which is one that I run. It is a group of queer and trans Muslim activists from across the country working to combat Islamophobia and support queer Muslims and a wide range of other things. And we have one for youth living with HIV, for young queer and trans folks of color, for young women of color. And then we have one for fighting for Title IX, for abortion access and abortion storytelling, and one for folks who want to focus on international issues, and a few others. So check out that link. And I just wanted to, plug that for folks that if you're interested and if you're within the age range to go ahead and apply, tell your friends. Okay, so some ground rules for today is that only the trainers will be sharing our screens, and that we love a lively chat. So feel free to send info, resources, ideas, thoughts, questions, but be respectful. Otherwise, if you do, if you disrupt the space or discriminating against folks or doing something that's just not cool, then you will be removed. And like I said earlier, the session is being recorded, and we'll send out the link afterwards. There's also an option for you to turn on live captioning to be more accessible to more folks. So there should be a closed caption icon that will appear within the Zoom window for all meeting participants. And you can use the up arrow next to this to show captions on your screen by clicking show subtitle. Okay, so let us know if you have any issues with that. And yeah, so welcome everyone. This is our direct action training. I'm so excited to introduce our trainer, Noor, who is a city superstar here in DC, has put on so many amazing actions and is such an incredible organizer with the DC Action Lab here in Washington, DC. And we're really excited to have Noor to present this direct action training. And yeah, there'll be some time for questions at the end, but if you want to follow our Instagram or our Twitter, there is the links. Cool, so I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to you, Noor.
Awesome. So I'm just gonna go ahead and set up my screen share. that. All right, everyone. So thank you for the introduction, Khadija. And thank you all so much for being here. I know somebody said they're 29 on the chat. I am also 29, so we can relate. But I really appreciate you all joining us tonight. And I know that we've gone through some folks have said where they're joining us from, but if you could enter your name, your pronouns, and where you're joining us from in the chat if you haven't done so already. That would be excellent. But today what I really wanted us to start off with, right, is that, wow, we have someone joining us from the Philippines. That's awesome. Is that sometimes like direct action and protest can just seem so far away, right? Like it can seem like something that is in another sphere. It's something that you have to really train to get to know, or that you need to have some kind of like special skill to be able to pull it together. So I'm here to demystify and debunk all of that and tell you that you are very likely practicing already in your daily life or have done so without recognizing it or being told that you did it, that you already have some of those skills inside you, right? So I wanted to start with that second question, which is, have you done any of these? Have you ever like helped someone with an injury? Have you ever been, and feel free to put this in the chat, have you ever calmed down a tense situation, right? Like whether that's like with a friend, whether that's at home, whether that's like at a grocery store, if somebody's acting wild, right? Like, have you ever had to put yourself in that situation or watch your tone and help sort of calm things down a little bit by putting yourself in that position? Have you ever taken a photo, right? This doesn't mean you need to have like a fancy camera, but have you ever been in a situation with a lot of people and been able to get a really powerful photo? I'm hearing from folks that yes, we've made a protest prop or sign, you've designed art. Again, you don't need to be an artist, right? It's like a matter of putting what your thoughts are and what your demands are on paper, or on wood. I have a bunch of wood carvings behind me from a protest, right? Like you can really salvage things from within your networks or home or your garden. And if you've sung or chanted, right? Like I would say that that's one of that's my growing edge is the singing and chanting. But I absolutely love how people are able to use music. And it's not just about, saying a chant that speaks to the issue, but it is also about using music to unify folks. Sometimes you can use music to halt something, right? You can incorporate instructions into music, and you can make a lot of noise to drown something out, right? Like if there's a counter protest happening, or if for instance someone's speaking or delivering something really awful, on a microphone, your songs and your chants can drown them out. So it's not only a unifying method, but it's also something that can be really dynamic, and actually stop something that you don't want to see happen. And similarly, I think the reason I brought up help someone with an injury or calm a tense situation, right, is that these days we're seeing more and more people get injured on the streets, right? Like it could be something like getting heat stroke, like it's getting warmer, right? Or like being dehydrated, or forgetting to eat in the morning. Or it could be tripping over something. It could be that, you accidentally trip over something, or it could be something that's a little bit scarier than that. Luckily, a lot of folks have medics that are part of their teams, but oftentimes we forget that we can do these things too, right? So it's a matter of incorporating that, into your life and what you end up taking to protests and actions, and knowing that you can also like help like throw some water on someone's knee and help them, get some gravel out. So I just wanted to demystify that a little bit. And then of course, calming a tense situation, right? Sometimes like I've been the person that is in that argument and had someone come in and say, hey, calm down. This is not, this is your friend. You probably don't want to have this argument out here when there's 1,000 people marching. Let's take a breather. But knowing that that's an important skill we'll get into. And the third question, have you seen a show of people power recently that inspired you? What was it? So I'm just going to read out some of the inspiring things I'm seeing in the chat. The walk to City Hall with George Floyd's family in Houston 2 weeks ago was such a powerful experience. Pedro says, a recent protest in Flatbush, a show of community. Being in New York and us being out there in thousands is my power inspiration. And also seeing folks say that, yes, so many forms of people power, including being on the front lines of these recent uprisings. And also some folks calling in from some little towns and small cities where protests might not be a part of your daily fabric, but has absolutely become a part of your daily fabric. And I think that's so courageous and truly a turning moment in history. And feel free to keep putting that down. Miss wrote, the people in the UK putting that statue in the harbor, agreed. That was absolutely fantastic. But then also seeing some of these statues come down like across the country, right? Is every day there's something new, but also thinking about how it's happening on a global level, and people are beginning to think about, like British colonizers and imperialists and military generals that are not necessarily seen as like part of the US context, but actually are, right? Because, white supremacy and racism is something that exists on all corners of the planet. All right, thank you, and keep it going. And I just wanted to start off by sharing an image I love. I'm seeing some nods, which means that people have seen this before, which is lovely. But this is one of my go-to images when I am starting a direct action training. And before I get started, I know Khadija mentioned a little bit about who I am, but I actually met Khadija during some really powerful youth-led actions here in DC a few years ago. And I am part of a work-owned collective called DC Action Lab, where I do direct action strategy. So thinking about, groups of 5 to 6 people that really, really want to pull off blocking a door to a building with a lot of hateful people in it, or something that is 1,000 people or 2,000 people, right? So like thinking through the teams that need to come together, the materials that we need to put together. So I'll be going over how those materials and teams, et cetera, work on both a small scale and a large scale, but I would say don't worry about the numbers during this training, because I think that all of the components that go into a large scale, like if you're accounting for 1,000 people, also matter when you're working with a really tiny team. It's the same principles. So I just want to make sure it's not breaking up for other folks, because I know Ava mentioned that. It is breaking up, or are you good?
It's fine for me.
It's fine for you? Okay, all right. I will try to get a little bit closer to the mic. Okay, so it seems like some folks have seen this image before. And I would love if you could just drop in the chat what this image means to you, or like what are the first things that come to mind when you see this? We have a big fish that's chasing after a bunch of little fish. Yes, stronger together, right? So like the principle of direct action, the principle of protest is unity, is solidarity. We know that people that have more power over us can chase us. They can try to take us over. But the more that we're unified in our principles, in our demands, and also better organized, right? Like what I love about this is that second fish, it just looks so much better than the first fish. It's like neatly organized. It has a really clear structure, and the other fish is freaking out now. So I just wanted to start with that image, because we're going to start off with an analysis of why power matters, and why people power matters specifically as an underlying principle when we're talking about direct action. So there are 4 different types of power. I think this list is always evolving, but this is the list that I generally use. And I'm sure some folks have seen this before, but I'm going to just do an overview of what these types of power are. So power over, right? Like that's the nefarious power that we don't like. That's what the boss or the state uses, right? From in terms of giving you rules, of deciding that something isn't permitted, or being, a lot more visceral with it. That's power over looks like prisons, power over looks like police, right? Power over looks like the military. Those are all forms of power over communities. Power with. So power with is where we want to be. Power with is horizontal organizing. That means that you are seeing people at the same level as you. That means that you're creating networks that are so powerful between you and another person, between communities, and building really solid relationships that end up actually being able to take over that power that's lingering over you. So when we're talking about direct action, the power with is what we want to harness, what we need to model and build. And we'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute. Power within, that is a notion that every single one of us has the power to act. For some folks, that might be your spirit or your faith. For others, that might just look like a willingness to be fully alive, to be present, to be participating as an agent of change. If you need to step back and you feel like you can't be present or participate, that doesn't mean you're giving up your power, right? That just means you're taking care of yourself in that moment. But each of us has that power within us. And then power under, that's when we give up the power that we have, or when it's taken from us, right? And we see that being challenged right now with the uprisings that are happening across the country. So that brings us into talking about what kind of power we actually need. We need organized people. So that means collectives. That means organizations like Advocates for Youth. That means unions, coalitions, cooperatives. We also need organized money, right? Like not everything's about money, but when we pool our resources, we do better. Whether that is making sure that someone has supplies, making sure that you're handing out water to folks, making sure that you're bailing people out where it's applicable, that's organized money. And then the last one is organized actions, right? For some folks that do electoral work or do get out the vote work, that looks like that political power organizing votes. For others, it's organizing actions. We live in a culture or a world of power over, no matter where you look, in workplaces, sometimes in our own communities, in states or nations. The power dynamics are the same across the world. And we look to those people with money or political power or some other kind of authority, whether that's a teacher or a doctor or someone on the news to tell us what to do. And what direct action does is take that power away and turn it into power of the people that relies on our collective spirit and many people taking action towards the same goal. And it is by nature resting on power with, on being decentralized and horizontal. Sometimes we feel like we don't have enough power to create the kind of world we want. And the state sure as hell does lots of things to ensure that we don't get it. But direct action and protest is a way that we challenge that status quo. So I'm going to move into talking about a little bit of a difference between civil disobedience and direct action. A lot of times it's conflated, right? A lot of times when someone's saying, hey, we're doing an action, we're going to get arrested. That's not always the purpose or the goal, right? Usually organizers have thought through if they're incorporating arrests as something that's part of their action design, they've thought it through. So I just wanted to go over a little bit of the difference between them. Of course, there's also arrests that happen and are happening across the country, not by design, right? But by virtue of the police arresting people with zero idea that they're gonna do it. So I wanted to start off with talking about the differences. So direct action is a very beautifully simple concept. It means that we take collective action to change our circumstances, and we do it ourselves. We don't hand our power to a middle person. So we've seen instances of direct action in stories throughout time, right? Like in every people's movement, in popular revolution in modern history. And direct action, has been coined by and practiced by people who have few resources that are seeking to liberate themselves from an injustice. And I was mentioning earlier, people often conflate direct action with getting arrested. While sometimes getting arrested can amplify your message or is strategically necessary to achieve your goal, or sometimes walking into a protest as someone who is being targeted by the police by virtue of who you are, right? We know that all of those things can happen, but that's not the goal of a direct action, right? Similarly, people often conflate direct action with civil disobedience. So civil disobedience is a very specific form of action that involves intentionally violating a law because that law is unjust. So if you're refusing to pay taxes that would fund a war, or refusing to comply with certain kind of legislation, in those circumstances, the action that you're choosing is because you purposefully want to break a law because it's wrong. With other kinds of direct action, it might happen so that the laws are broken, but the law being broken isn't the point, right? That's not why you're doing it. So for example, if you're breaking into a building so you can drop a banner, you are probably breaking some trespassing laws, but that's not why you're doing it. You're not protesting trespassing laws. You're protesting an unjust system. So while associated with confrontation, direct action at its core is about power. A smart direct action assesses power dynamics and finds a way to shift them. One way of thinking about power is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's two kinds, right? There's organized money and organized people. So we might not have billions of dollars to buy politicians and governments, but with direct action, organized people leverage risk, leverage freedom, leverage comfort, your safety, or your privilege. So just going over those differences, I wanted to start off with one principle that I think is coming up frequently, especially as we're seeing multi-gender, multiracial, multi-class, all of the different diversities come to the forefront during these uprisings. So I wanted to start off with a principle from a group called Beautiful Trouble that I always return to, and it's called Taking Risks but Taking Care. Direct action involves significant levels of risk for all involved. It is imperative to be careful, conscious, and deliberate about the risks you take. A good action planner distinguishes between the risks that he, she, they can and should minimize and the ones they cannot, and will explain to all participants the potential consequences. So as we go through this, we'll see some moments, right, where if you are planning an action or a protest, there's times where you can step back and think, hey, this is a really good time where we can think about what some non-Black people of color or non-Black participants, for instance, in our demonstration can do to ensure that folks that are the most impacted are able to take up the space and to be powerful and with each other and feel supported. So that's an example of something that a facilitator or an organizer can purposefully do in the design of a direct action to make sure that we're realizing that not everyone faces the same level of risk, though with a direct action, everyone does face some risk, right? And I know that you all did go through a legal training yesterday or a jail support training. So you probably went through, some concepts about how different communities move through the legal system. But I just wanted to put that out there as a really good example of taking a step back and saying, hey, we have undocumented folks in our midst. We have trans and queer folks in our midst. The way that they're going to be treated by the police or treated once they're in jail is going to be different than some of us, right? So making sure that we're working that into our plans, working that into our safety plans, and ensuring that we have each other's backs. So what is nonviolent direct action, right? And I just wanted to go through a few different examples of what they are. So the types of direct action: protest. So registering dissent, i.e. explaining when you're mad, right? So marches. What we see in a world of labor or workplaces is pickets, right? When we see people walk out of their workplace with their placards and walk around in circles, that's the oldest form of an organized protest. There's also non-cooperation. And we're actually seeing this happen right now in a way that hasn't been seen in this country in so many ways, with people refusing to buy in businesses that are operated by racists or that are run by people that don't pay folks the living wage, or for people that aren't giving their workers paid sick leave in a global pandemic, right? So we're seeing non-cooperation, which is a very brave form of direct action, happen in pockets of the country, whether that is a meat warehouse in the Midwest, right? Or whether that is an Amazon building on Staten Island. So non-cooperation is something that is happening on a massive scale and is happening in every corner of the country right now. The third is intervention, right? So when you see a photo of somebody chained to a tree, right? You're chained to a tree, or you've designed a tree sit, which is when you actually you're lofted up at the top of a tree, and you actually stay there because your forest is about to be cut down so they can build a pipeline out of it, right? So that's a direct action relying on intervention, directly blockading or intervening in a system that you know is unjust. It also looks like blockading a building, right? So whether that is the entrance of a corporation, whether that is looking at ICE headquarters or detention centers, and deciding that you're going to block that building so work doesn't continue as normal. And the fourth one that I wanted to bring up that I think is so brave, and really beautiful, and there's some examples that really come to mind, but one of them is creative solutions, which means developing alternative community-based systems. So this one takes a bit of thinking, right? In terms of really analyzing what the community needs and using direct action to deliver it. But an example I wanted to bring up, and I'll make sure this goes out to you all after this, is that after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, there were schools that were shut down across the state. And I know we have some folks from Louisiana here. And a group of direct action organizers and community members ended up finding a site that had been abandoned, where a school was permanently shut down, because that's usually how disaster relief works, right? Like, oh, we're going to rebuild a school, but no, we're actually going to shut it down and maybe have private education or private institution come in instead. And what these organizers did is that they actually occupied that job site. They just like moved in and they rebuilt a school and opened a school, right? So that's a form of direct action that actually creates something that your community needs. And one other example that I would bring up is that a few years ago, well, more than a few years ago, in the 80s, there was a push to have daycare centers be open in Rhode Island, and the government was refusing to fund them. So a group of families ended up going into city council, going into the office, and literally building a daycare center inside the building. So they just like stayed there for a whole week, you know, ended up having food, ended up having childcare amongst themselves, and they won, right? It doesn't always end up in winning, but it's a practice of feeling like you're winning, and practicing the way that you want to be in relationship with each other, which is why direct actions are incredible, but also why creative solutions are some of the hardest direct actions to pull off, because it requires a unified demand and a commitment to an end goal. So why direct action? So one really important thing that I wanted to bring up is conflict, right? So sometimes when we hear the word conflict, we freak out. We say, okay, want to avoid conflict, I'm conflict averse. But when you're talking about actually confronting power, right? People that have power over you, your direct action needs to force some conflict with your target, right? So whether that's a mayor, whether that's a bank, you need to be able to force your target into a situation where they have to respond to you. That doesn't mean responding with force, right? But that means you're giving them a decision about where they want to be. So as sort of the term goes, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. So some actions with goals like blockades or sit-ins or like the tree sits I just talked about require that conflict with your target, where they actually have to make a decision, right? They have to decide if they're gonna call the cops to have you forcibly removed, or whether they're gonna actually bring in the bulldozers and actually try to take down that tree, right? So those are some decisions that your target has to make, that you can then have on the record saying, hey, you actually decided that you would rather tear down this forest and put my life at risk rather than have a conversation. So that's what I meant by conflict. The second one that I know we started digging into a little bit is that horizontal organizing and practicing strategy and accountability. the most beautiful thing about direct action, when it's done well, when it's done communally, is that you make agreements about the types of actions you will take, and you hold each other accountable for keeping those agreements. So whether that is something simple, right? Like what Khadija showed in the beginning of this presentation, right? Like that's an example of an agreement about how we're going to be together during this webinar. But with a direct action and building a team, whether that's a protest, whether that's a blockade, you want to make sure you're on the same page, right? You want to make sure that you know that if the cops do end up coming, here's what we're willing to say to them. Here's the person who's going to say it. If the press wants to interview someone, we're going to make sure that they're interviewing XYZ people instead of, you know, other folks that might not be directly impacted by the issue. But it's also practicing accountability, right? Like with a direct action, you need everyone that's on your team to pull their weight, right? So if somebody doesn't show up and they have all the trash bags or they have all the snacks, like that means that somebody else is going to have to leave that action and there's a hole in your team. So I would say that the strongest relationships that I've built, and I'm sure other folks on this call can attest to this, like come through direct action, because you get to really hold yourself and hold each other responsible and accountable. The third one is community skills, relationships, and organizing. Oftentimes what we see, especially in a world of rapid response, is we don't take enough of a step back and realize that we learned something, right? It's like, oh, I actually learned this new skill I didn't know I had. I actually didn't know that I was comfortable coming up with chants. I didn't know that I was comfortable in the midst of a march and getting people to slow down so folks with accessibility issues could get ahead, right? Like those are things that you learn while you're doing this, that builds power in a way that is so quick and so beautiful. So I would invite, as you're thinking about direct action, to think about the skills that you want to learn, but also the skills that you want your community to learn. And the last one is, it's a liberatory space for dreaming. I know that's a wild, big phrase, but direct action is a time where you can envision and live briefly in the world that you want to. So whether that is like, hey, everyone's getting free food and water right now. Someone's actually checking in on my mental health, making sure I'm hydrated, making sure that I'm not getting a heat stroke. You know, we're ensuring that we have accessibility built into our plans. We're making sure that we have art, that we're paying local artists. That's a model of community building that we don't always embrace, but a direct action can be that space where you put some of that into practice together. So never let that fourth thing go, because sometimes we're so used to just saying, hey, we're going out, we're doing this march, but think about what component brings you to that vision of the world that you're seeking through this, and find space for yourself to be able to live that within an action, whether that is making sure that you have a circle, right? If you have a circle in the beginning or the end, where people ground themselves or do some breathing together, or whether you do bring in something like, hey, we're going to do a really quick talent show. We're going to have each person actually like present like a song or a dance or some other wild skill they have, right? Like try to incorporate those moments into your actions, because there's not too many places in the world that we have those. And the last sort of note on that front is that something that is really excellent about direct action is that you need to tell everyone everything in your team, right? So it's not a place where you can really say, hey, I'm not going to tell you this information. It's a place where you have to be in transparent communication with each other, to make sure everyone has all the information, so that you're organizing without fear of repercussion from within your group. The only thing you really need to worry about is how to keep that structure tight when you're out on the street. So I'm going to move into talking about picking a target, right? So obviously right now we do have some very clear targets, right? Like whether that is your mayor or your city council, when we're talking about policing work, right? That actually holds the strings to the budget if you're trying to defund the police, right? Or if you're trying to push for another kind of reform. Right now it's a little bit clear what those are. But when you're working with other different campaigns, you might have to do a little bit more thinking. So I just wanted to talk through two different kinds of targets, and I will definitely talk a little bit more about Beautiful Trouble at the end, because I think y'all should know them. So picking a target. When we plan our actions and campaigns, we have to understand our targets and what makes them tick. So you want to take care to focus on the person with the power to meet our demands, whether that is signing a check, whether that's passing legislation, or whether that's canceling a really terrible development contract that you don't want to see in your community, right? So not every target is vulnerable in the same way. For instance, a blockade, an occupation, or a creative disruption may be really effective against one target, but not against another. What works once may not work a second time. So we need to figure out where our target is weakest and where we are strongest. What actions can we take that are outside their experience and what they're not willing to deal with? So nothing rattles a target more than something they aren't prepared to deal with. You might not have enough power to push your primary target at first, but your actions may help you identify a secondary target, an individual or group that can be pressured to leverage their influence on the primary target. So you have your number one target, and then you have somebody who might be able to get to the person that's number one. So an example that I would want to bring up in this situation is that I was running a campaign around removing Trump from Twitter. And we had some success in getting, we had about like 300,000 petitions. We held a rally outside the Twitter headquarters. But we knew that Jack from Twitter, right? Like he wasn't going to respond to us and our group of community organizations. Like, it's not something that he goes on the record about. But the secondary target that we ended up finding was the head of culture and affairs who didn't even live in San Francisco. And it was somebody who I looked at the staff directory. I ended up finding her handle on Twitter. Unlike Jack, she didn't have like as many followers. She was sort of on the low a little bit. And she ended up being the person that responded to us. So she, despite us not winning in that campaign, and despite Jack never responding to us, what ended up happening at that protest after I sent her an email with all of the letters and the signatures was that she actually sent their staff out to receive our petitions. And they sent us a letter inviting us to a meeting, right? So we didn't win that campaign, but I would say that something that we did end up doing is finding how to get to the people that are in power there. And understanding that sometimes when you keep on knocking at the person that is your primary target and they don't respond, you have to do a little bit more research to get to the second. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think a lot of times, especially if you're running multiple actions, especially as part of like a long-term strategy, right? It would be helpful to do a really deep like analysis, looking through those staff directories, looking into, for instance, shareholders, right? So like when you're thinking about a company that's as big as Amazon, right? And we're seeing a lot of people organize against Amazon right now. We know that, the world, I think he's a trillionaire now. We know that we know Jeff Bezos is not gonna respond to us, but we do know that there's some shareholders that go to board meetings, that might sit on boards of other banks or other corporations that we might have some insight into, right? So feel free to be creative and remember to do that research on the front end, so that you're able to pivot, right? So that you know that, hey, it looks like this building is closed and this person that we're trying to get to isn't at home. Who are the secondary targets? Like building that into your plan so that you have a plan B, especially when you have folks that are out on the streets. So now we're going to get into talking a little bit about action design. So the first, just giving folks an overview of what I mean when I talk about action design is that just regrounding us in what direct action is about. You're directly intervening in an injustice. You're asserting and defending your rights. You're showing a willful refusal to cooperate or participate in an injustice, and you're offering community-based solutions. You're ensuring that people's voices are heard, and you are sounding the alarm. You're letting other people know that they can join the struggle, that they should know about what's happening, whether that is a development site in your neighborhood, whether that is a forest that is, being destroyed to bring chemicals through the mountains in the state you live in, or whether that is the issue of police brutality in the town or city that you live in. So just going over the main tenets of action design. The first one is your target or action site, right? So the first one, when we're talking about target, we talked about a primary target, we talked about a secondary target, but something that's really important is to take your time to get to know where your action is going to be, right? So some of the questions that I ask myself, a phrase for this is scouting, okay? So it's like you are going to the park where you're planning on having this action. You want to make sure you know how people can get there, right? So in DC, where we have a public metro system, I make sure that I measure how the distance between the closest metros across different lines or tracks. I try to see if there's an easy way to get there on a bus, or whether there's a bike rack, right? Like you want to really get to know that for accessibility reasons, to make sure that the community is able to actually get where you want them to go. But you also want to think about that in terms of inclusivity, right? Are there steps of stairs to get into the action site? And if there are there ramps? Are there elevators, right? You want to ask those things. Another thing that, especially when you're planning a direct action, that's something like a blockade, right? You want to think about, hey, what kind of door is this? Is this a revolving door? Is this a double door? Like those are some questions that you want to think about if you're gonna try to block an entrance, right? But if you're having a protest or a march, you want to really get to know the roads and the streets that you're going to be on. You want to make sure that you have one route that you're publicizing, but you also want to make sure you have a plan B or C, right? Because sometimes the street is mysteriously blocked off, or there's traffic, or the police decide to do something arbitrary to change your design. So you want to make sure that you really, really know the area and also know how to communicate about where it is to the folks that you're inviting. The second one is mobilization. So it's important to be like realistic, but also aspirational about how many people you want to come, right? So like, because you have to plan for all of those people to be there. So thinking about, hey, my team decided that if we have 50 people here at this first protest we're doing, that's our goal. We want to make sure that we have at least 50 people. You also want to think through how you're getting them there, right? So whether that is arranging carpools, whether that is arranging like bike routes, whether that is like sometimes folks end up pitching in to get seats on a bus. Those are all things that you want to explore. And you also want to make sure that you're welcoming people as they come in, and really having some space and a strategy to get to know them. The third is messaging and demands, right? Especially if you're starting an action or a campaign from scratch. So if that is an issue, right, that's happening in your neighborhood and you're the first person to say, hey, we need to do something about this, and you're bringing a group together, the first thing you should do is really think about what your demands are, and making sure you're on the same page, right? So that if someone's going and saying, yeah, we want to make sure that this corporation doesn't build anything in the city ever again, but somebody else on your team says, well, we would compromise if the development site was on the outskirts of the city, right? So that happens all the time. Even when you have like a really, really well-resourced, large organization that's been doing this stuff for a long time, sometimes we're just not on the same page. And we're seeing that happen right now, unfortunately, right? Is like when you're seeing organizers say, hey, no, we're asking to defund the police. And someone else is like, no, I don't think we should say that. And those are the folks that end up getting an interview in the press, right? So you want to make sure that your demands and your messaging is spelled out at the forefront. The fourth is resources. Again, I'm not talking about money, though money is definitely important when you're trying to get supplies or things of that variety. But sorry, someone's saying they can't hear me. I'm muted. Are other folks having a problem with hearing me? Okay. All right, I'll keep going. So with resources, it's not, let's not think about money right now. Let's think about the actual skills that you have in your group, right? Do you have folks that have time Do you have people that have some kind of expertise? Do you have artists in your community? Do you have photographers in your community? Do you have someone who's a journalist, who's a writer? Do you have someone who maybe was the editor of a newspaper and knows how to like really write an incredible op-ed or a letter to the editor, and explain your cause and your demands? So I would start with mapping out the resources in your own community and then thinking about what you need money for, right? Like sometimes you do actually need some tangible resources to be able to buy, for instance, like cases of water or a Gatorade, or making sure that you have a new bullhorn or a megaphone so people can hear you, right? But really think about what community resources you have first, and you might find that you actually have a lot of them within your group. The fifth one is thinking about allies, right? So if you are someone from the impacted community that is bringing an issue to the forefront and organizing around an action, you want to really think through who the people are in your community that are on your side. And sometimes it's folks that you might not have thought of, right? Like we can immediately say, hey, you know, we know that the folks that are doing climate work might be interested in this action we're doing against new development in our city or town. But it might also be folks that work on issues that you haven't thought about before. So I would really spend some time mapping out who your friends could be and what they're able to offer you, and coming up with the asks that you have for them, right? Not every organization or not every community group can offer you everything, but if you have a list that you can point them to saying, hey, I actually really need someone to help me with some writing so that I'm able to pitch these demands to people, or to help us like put a website together or a Facebook event, or someone to just check like social media and see how people are talking about us, right? So coming up with that list that you can point people to, and especially people that have more resources or have a full-time staff, or anything like that. And then the last one is your scenario, right? Like what are you actually trying to do? What is within the experience of the group? And do you have time to train people? So sometimes, folks want to do something as 3 or 4 people in a group and end up having 50 people come in, and they don't feel prepared. They're a little scared. They might not have been trained in how to do something that's new. So for instance, like blockading a building, like you need to have a little bit of grounding, and an understanding of the consequences before you do that. So you really want to spend some time thinking about the scenario, if it makes sense for where you're at, right? Sometimes when you're approaching a target for an action for the first time, maybe you don't want to go straight to the blockade. Maybe you don't want to like chain yourself to the door. Maybe the first thing that you want to do is have a rally outside and invite different people that have been impacted to tell their stories. Maybe the second thing that you do is a vigil or some sort of like art action or installation. And then maybe by that time you've brought in enough people that are willing to take risks, that are willing to get trained, and that can be a part of something that's a little bit more escalated. But if just a suggestion, and I think I've definitely been guilty of rushing to what I see as like the most exciting or the most important. But sometimes it's good to take a few steps back and say, is that really the most effective tactic for me to do right now? Is that really going to get my demands across? And most importantly, is my group, is the community that is planning this and doing this with me, are they ready? And what do they need to be ready? So next, the fun stuff, prepping for an action. So I know that we've really been in a rapid response mode, right? And I define rapid response as something terrible happens and we have to get out on the streets. We have to take care of each other. We have to stand up for what's right. We have to do it quickly. And a lot of us, don't have time to like sit back and like think through, hey, let me go down this list and make sure that I have everything. But I'll make sure that you all get this after. But this is like a snapshot of some of the things that action organizers make sure to do in the lead up, right? So even if you have a week, even if you have 3 days, Here are some of my must-dos. So the first one is recruitment, right? Oftentimes it's just a Facebook event, right? Or it's just like an Instagram post. But if you're planning on having multiple actions, or if you know that you're part of a campaign that's going to take a few months, you can really focus on the recruitment, right? So like really building your group up. Some ways that that can happen is if somebody has website skills, they can make a website for you, or it can be something as simple as a sign up form, right? Like it can be something as simple as a Google form that you can make just so you get people's names and numbers. And something I always like asking folks is, what skills do you have, right? Like, is there something that you do? Because again, remember, we're mapping our resources from our community first. The second one is phone banking and texting. So sometimes what phone banking means when organizations do phone banking is that they have lists of members, right? So that means that they have your phone number, they know that they can call on you when something comes up, when they want you to be engaged with something. And phone banks are really good ways to get a commitment from someone to come to something. I won't say that I'm the best recipient of phone banking. So if somebody calls me and I don't recognize the number, I'm like, nope, I'm not going to pick up. But there's some people that do actually respond, that do actually have a conversation and want to know more, right? So you want to be maintaining those lists. Once you have a sign up form, you want to make sure that you're getting people's phone numbers and following up with them. Another way to do that is texting. So there's various ways, there's various platforms that you can use, and I'll make sure to send them in the follow-up resources. But you can definitely arrange mass texts to a whole list if you have their cell phones. Another way that you can do that if you don't have those resources is really just split up those numbers amongst your organizing group, right? It's like, and I'm just going to name people that I see on the screen, but like David, if you have like 20 people and Amanda has 20 people and Khadija has 20 people, like we all probably text a lot, right? Like that's going to take 10 to 15 minutes if you have a script that you can just copy and paste, right? And you decide to do that to everyone in your contact list, or you have a list of phone numbers that you know you're going to reach out to. And then the third one is outreach emails. So you want to make sure that, especially when you're working on your messaging and demands, like we discussed in the last slide, that you have a really clear, really short email that explains who you are, what you're planning, and why it's important that they come. As you're getting closer to the action or the protest, you can get a little bit more lengthy with it, right? You can say, hey, the weather looks like it's raining. It might be a little cold. It might be a little warm. Make sure you're bringing layers. This is where we're going to be meeting. Here's how to get there. So really like incorporating all of those pieces in as you get closer to the action, but then also ensuring that you're keeping, again, like really solid lists, right? So like, who are you doing outreach to? Is it communities in neighboring cities? Is it other organizations or like-minded people in your town? Or is it, if you're planning on engaging in, you know, like an official, elected official in your town, sometimes it's okay to invite them to come because you know they're going to say no, right? So you can always say, hey, we invited you to this thing. You chose not to come and listen to your community, right? So outreach emails not only meet the goal of bringing people to your event, but also meet the goal of actually bringing bringing strategic actors to your protest as well. The next one is talking about messaging, right? You want to make sure you have a slogan. So whether that is, just 3 words, 4 words that everyone can say, that everyone, that gets out of a car or off a subway can say, hey, I'm going to the XYZ protest. You want to make sure that you have something clear and easy. For your team, you also want to make sure you have talking points. I know we were talking about messaging and demands, so this can be your demands, right? It's like, here are the 3 things we want. These are the compromises we're not willing to make. And here's why we're here. It doesn't need to be fancy, but just making sure that the whole team knows what you're doing and why you're doing it. Your messaging should also be a part of your art, right? Sometimes when we see mass protests, especially in DC, right, you see a lot of people with printed signs. That's fine. That's good to like pull together really quick. But there's something really beautiful about putting your demands and your messages on homemade art. So something that we call this is an art build. So that means that you can, if someone has a backyard, if someone has a garage, if there is an art space or some other kind of workspace that you could find in a school or college, you could have an art build. What that looks like is that you have stencils, that you have old bed sheets, that you have paper, you have paint, you have markers, and you basically keep it open all day. And people come in and out and collaborate on art together, right? So that's a really, really crucial component, at least to me, of making sure that your action is dynamic and that it has some diversity to it in terms of what people are carrying and holding, right? And then, of course, there's props. You might sometimes see people with a costume on, right? You might see some people bring in performance to what they're doing, whether that is stilts, right? Whether that is a gigantic butterfly, talking about migration and why migration is beautiful at a protest at the Supreme Court, right? So thinking about props is something I would encourage you to do. And then also brochures or leaflets. So I've been to many, many actions, and I've also been guilty of this, is that one of the things that we always forget is actually bringing people into our work, right? So you want to make sure that you have some kind of quarter pager, or you have a barcode that people can scan, or a website, that you can easily show people so that they know who you are, especially if they're not engaged. You want to constantly be thinking about how to build your group up, how to bring more people into the movement and keep the momentum going. And the last one is chant sheets. I don't always do this, but if you aren't someone who's like comfortable with coming up with some chants on the fly or really good at rhyming, it might make sense to think through a few chants and practice them with other organizers beforehand and be a little creative with it. We'll go into decision-making structures in a bit, but I also just wanted to point out that even with horizontal organizing, which means that there's no like key, there's no like president of the action or like a director of the action, even then it's important that you have a decision-making structure so that you know who's holding what piece. If, someone is reached out to talk to the cops, or whether that's someone who's asked to speak or leave, that you're all able to communicate with each other and figure out a plan together. And it's a really good exercise in team building. And you also want to make sure you have a communication system for that, right? So what I have used in the past, is just a Signal, which is an encrypted communication service. That's an app that you can get on your phone. I usually create a Signal group. I've also used WhatsApp before, or GroupMe, but you want to make sure that you have a solid communication system. And sometimes if you're feeling a little bit nervous, you can also incorporate some check-ins during the day, right? You can say, hey, no matter what, every half an hour, we're going to have a 1-minute huddle over here on the side of the action. We're just going to make sure we're all good. So making sure that you have eyes on each other and ears. Media. Again, if you have time and you have resources in your group, it's good to convert those talking points, right? Those messaging and the demands and the outreach emails. You already have the language. You can just put something really quick together that's inviting the media to cover your protest. You don't have to do this. It might be that you don't want the media there, but it's good to consider it as you're planning your action. Also, if you have allies within your groups, if you have organizations that do work with the media frequently, get them to call them, right? Like that's a really good ask for allies. That's a really good ask for organizations in your community or city that have those relationships, right? That like the director of that organization's on the news sometimes and speaks to the media. That might be someone you call, say, hey, can you like leverage those connections? We want to make sure that the local news station's at our action. And then logistics prep, and we'll get into that in a second. But some of the key things is making sure you have a way to be heard, right? And if you don't have a bullhorn or sound system, we'll talk through that as well. Armbands, so making sure that like people know who the organizers are, know who the volunteers are, water, snacks, definitely a sign-up sheet, and some clipboards. So I just want to go over what this looks like on the day off your action, right? You definitely want to start with a check-in in the morning. It's probably smart to check in the day before as well, but a good check-in in the morning with a full team. And these are the different teams that I usually have in my actions. And again, all of this is different depending on the size of your group and what you're doing. But you want to have a comms team, even if you're not trying to get press there. You want to make sure that people know what you're doing, right? So you want to make sure you have somebody that's like, okay, I'm going to tweet out the whole day. I'm going to go on Instagram Live. I'm going to do some kind of live stream. You also want to make sure that you have a point of contact if the media does show up, right? So that if, for instance, the media comes and ends up interviewing someone who's not on your side, right? Like that's something that unfortunately the media does do. So you want to make sure that you have a point of contact who can easily spot those things and answer them. The second one, this is the team I like being in the most, is the caretakers and care bearers. So those are the folks that are making sure that people are hydrated, making sure that people have food and snacks. Whether that is like before, like just setting up a table, or sometimes if you have bikers in your group, right, they can just circle the protest on their bikes with backpacks or baskets and make sure that folks are hydrated. And also making sure that people have sugar, right? Like something that I always try to bring is some oranges, a fancy thing that I enjoy bringing are grapes. It's like a really good cooling snack for a protest, or just like boxes of granola bars. Again, this is one of the things where you actually might need resources. So this is a good ask for some of those partner organizations, right? It's like, can you just drop off some water? Can you have your adult staff, et cetera, step in this moment? The third is jail and legal support. And I know you all had a training on this yesterday. But in some places, if bail, is a system that is in your city, then you need to have a jail and legal support team. Your legal support team and your jail support team sometimes work together, but a legal support team is often like the long haul, right? To like make sure that if you're going to be in court, that you have someone there. Your jail support team, someone who like deals with your immediate needs. So if you have medication that you need to take, if you've been jailed, your jail support team is the person who's going to advocate for you. They're also going to make sure that they have your stuff, right? Sometimes you get arrested by accident. You might not have thought that was going to happen, but if it's part of your direct action, you've kind of been planning towards it, then you want to think through what you're bringing. So for instance, making sure that you don't have any fine jewelry that you don't want to lose, right? Or something that really matters to you that might get lost if the police are inventorying your materials. But your jail support team is also someone who comes and greets you, right? Who makes sure that when you're out, you have a smiling face, you have some pizza, you have some water, and that you have a way to get home. The fourth thing is a police liaison. Regardless of how you want to engage with the police, it's likely that they're going to try to talk to you, right? They're going to try to figure out what's happening. They're going to try to figure out what your plans are. It might be that you've already talked to them or given them a heads up that you're coming. Everyone has different approaches or tactics to how they engage with the police. But regardless of what anyone says, my rule of thumb is one police liaison, always, right? Because the way that the police function is that they might try to give folks alternative information. They might try to get information from one person over the other if they're not getting it from you. So it's really important to make sure that there's only one person that's communicating with the police, and that everyone on your team and is able to spot you and tell you immediately if the police are asking questions, right? So police liaison shouldn't have any other roles. Your only role is to communicate with the police. The fifth one is medics. So even if you're not doing something that's particularly risky, I always want to make sure that I'm inviting medics or planning for medics. That doesn't mean that we think this is going to be something that has heavy injuries or we're taking that kind of risk beforehand. But it is just a matter of making sure that if someone does pass out or gets dehydrated or again like trips over something or hurts themselves in some other way, that you have a plan. So I would recommend, so for instance in DC, the George Washington Hospital, which is part of the university here, like they actually have a team of medics that I've worked with before. But it's likely that your city or town has some people that have gone through a medic training. I know that there's going to be a medic training that Advocates for Youth is hosting next week, just to get some basic skills of how to do some first aid and signs to watch out for, especially because summer's coming. So, you know, that means that people get really tired and exhausted really quick, regardless of your health. Set up crew, cleanup crew, right? I would say from my experience in DC, it's terrible. People, you know, people come and leave a lot of trash behind. And you want to make sure that you're taking care of the place you're going, regardless of if it's like the street in front of your opponent's house. Like, you still want to make sure that you're not leaving your stuff there. So definitely set aside some folks that are the setup crew that get there early, that make sure that all the signs are there, or that all the trash bags are there, or snacks are there, and then also making sure you have a separate cleanup crew that doesn't have another role, so they have some energy and are able to make sure the area is clean. The next one is program. I don't think every rally or every protest or every action has to have a program, right? Like, but you do, if you are going to have a program, you want to make sure that you have someone that is introducing the speakers. Always a good idea to have some music. If there is music that is political or speaks to the moment or the issue, you want to integrate that in. You want to make sure you have language interpretation, right? So like when you have your sign up forms that we talked about on the last slide, a great question to ask is if folks have any accessibility needs. You might find out that you have a lot of folks with various disabilities that you should be taking into account, right? Like whether that is that you want to make sure that you have a team that is keeping the pace of the march and making sure that folks in wheelchairs or folks that have other walking aids are able to fully participate. That's a good thing to incorporate into your sign up. Same with ASL, right? Like we want to make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible. So asking those questions on your sign up form is great. And if you want to learn more about interpretation, especially for languages, feel free to, I'll put my email at the end just so you can reach out to me and I can tell you a little bit about how that functions if you haven't experienced like a multilingual space before. Vibes team, so important, right? So you want to make sure that people's energy is up, especially because again, the stuff can get really long, right? Like you can end up having 50 people speak and you think all of them are incredible, but that doesn't mean the energy is not going to dip down, right? So you want to make sure that, again, you're incorporating artists, make sure that you have some chant leaders. So even if you have some incredible people that are going to keep those chants up, after a while, they're going to be tired and their voices are not going to be able to carry through. So you want to make sure you have some rotating chants, you have some rotating chant leaders. Another great thing to think about is music in terms of instruments, right? Like, do you have a marching band, you know, that might be able to you know, chip in or come be a part, right? There's nothing that's more incredible than having like some horns or some drums just be a part of your action. And then there's also other kinds of noisemakers, right? Like some people bring shakers, some people bring whistles. Like there's lots of things that we have in our lives, or probably if you have younger siblings or have kids, like rattles. Like there's so many things that we take for granted that could actually be really incredible, really cheap, and really easy to use. Marshals are another piece. And I could go on and on about marshals for a long time, but especially with marches where you're going to be going into traffic, it's important that you have some people that are clearly designated, right? Like when I work with marshals, they have orange vests on. So folks know that they're like making sure that the traffic's away from the crowd, that people are stopping at intersections, keeping an eye out on whether something is wrong, and also answering basic information. Again, marshals is something that a lot of different organizations do differently. But if you are thinking of incorporating marshals into your action design, I think something, and I'm happy to send a handout about what marshals are or aren't. They're not the police, right? So marshals aren't people that are going to tell you like, don't do this. They're people that are going to remind you about what the goals are, but they're not going to use force against you. They're really here to be the eyes and the ears on the protest and make sure folks are safe. Last one, and again, some of these roles can be combined, is recruitment and follow-up. like one of the hardest things about mass protest and actions is that organizers get tired, right? Like after a long day outside, the last thing you want to do is send emails to everyone saying, hey, thanks for coming, come to the next meeting, right? Or another component is actually if you're like building out your group, you want to be identifying leaders. You want to be identifying potential organizers that you could be training up, right? So you see someone really like take off on a chant, you see someone come with a beautiful sign, like you want to make sure that you have folks that are refreshed, that aren't doing all of the other above things, and have some capacity immediately after the action to get those sign up sheets, to get them into an email list and follow up with them immediately, right? The magic is in the follow up. So whether that is like usually, and I know I can some of my fellow organizers say I'm a little ridiculous about this, but I always say if you don't get folks after the 2 hours after an action, you might not be able to get them back. It's human attention, it's human focus. So you want to make sure that you're following up and actually being a little bit annoying about it. And this is my last slide, which is exploring your core team, right? So I know we talked about horizontal structures, but sometimes it makes sense to have one person from each of the teams we just discussed, right? So like making sure that you have like one person from each of the crews, and making sure that they're sort of like moving all the work around. Sometimes it makes sense to have a facilitator. This is something that you and your group can decide. I personally always love having a facilitator. That's not someone who's like owning the work or being the boss, but that's someone who's just making sure that things are moving, right? That's someone who's like, hey, I'm going to schedule our call. I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. I want to make sure that I have our checklist of all the things all the supplies that we have to get. So I would recommend thinking about that as part of your structure as well. So I will stop there and stop my screen share. And I know that we probably have some questions, so I will wait to hear what those are, and I'm excited to answer them.
Hey, so you were going to say a little more about Beautiful Trouble, I think? Oh, got it.
Perfect. So yes, Beautiful Trouble is an incredible collective of trainers, designers, artists that their website is beautifultrouble.org. Highly recommend them, especially if you want to learn a little bit more about the principles that I just discussed. I think something else that's really exciting about Beautiful Trouble is how they incorporate art into protest and really thinking about creativity and creative intervention. So beautifultrouble.org.
And then another question I saw, and I thought this was kind of interesting, was someone asked me how to balance your own enthusiasm and like drive for leadership with honoring the leaders who are already established, and like how do you gauge when to step up and when to step back?
That's a really good question, right? Like I think that all movements benefit from added capacity, from added energy, from added power. If you are new to a movement that's already established, I would recommend being really clear and being really intentional about your relationship building, right? Like if you're engaging on an issue that other members of your community have already engaged on, the first recommendation that I would have is reaching out to them. Just being honest, saying, hey, I don't want to step on your toes. If you already have something that's being planned, but here's what my group is. Here's some of the things we're interested in. Is there a role that we can play in your organizing, or like, do you have any guidance from us on how to incorporate our strategy? But always do that. Do that check-in first, because it can create some friction and also be a little bit disrespectful, especially on the point of demands, right? Especially if they've been working really hard on a set of demands, and then you might come in with something new.
Another question I saw a little earlier in the chat was, do you think folks should reach out to the police beforehand, or is there any merit to that?
Yeah, I think that people have different levels and it depends on where you are. So there's been times, for instance, in DC where I know that if I showed up, they would immediately kick us out, right? Like if I have like 10 people that are coming from all across the country, I know that they're going to immediately be removed from this park and the protest will be off. In those instances, you want to really check in with every member and say, us talking to the cops beforehand means that there's likely going to be some police presence either way, but that also means that they know what we're doing. So I would say it really depends on your demands. It depends on your group's comfort level, and it also depends on what you're bringing to the protest, right? So at least in DC, if you're bringing a stage, right? If you have like a platform or you have a generator, like those are things that the police are probably going to take away from you really quickly, right? But if you're just showing up on the street, it's a little less likely that you're going to have to converse with them. So I would say talk to your group, see what they're feeling and doing, understand what that means in terms of police presence at your protest, and then make the decision from there. And frankly, if your group is not interested in negotiating with the police beforehand, you should adapt your plan so that you don't have to necessarily converse with them before.
Thanks. And then I think the last one that I saw, and then I'll turn hosting duties back over to Khadijah, was can you talk a little bit about how you've adapted, some strategies or ways you've adapted during the pandemic?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing, right, is that the government isn't giving people masks, right? Like masks should be free. Hand sanitizer should be free. Unfortunately, corporations like profit off of the essential things we need to be able to stay safe and not get sick. So when I was talking about resources and how to talk to allies and other organizations, what I've been asking people for, especially organizations that maybe have some resources and money, is, hey, can you just show up with some masks? Can you have a hand sanitizing station? Can you just provide that? So that might be something that you want to think through when you're mapping your allies out to make sure that people have masks on and are staying clean and fresh. The second one is that if you are imagining that there's masses of people there and there might be folks that don't have masks on, you might have to shift your strategy a little bit, right? So ways that I've adapted to that is definitely, the legacy of car parades and organizing caravans through a city, which is a really wonderful way to demonstrate solidarity. And also do it in a really fun way with a lot of noise and block some traffic for a bit. Another way that I've actually seen it happen, this happened recently in Philadelphia, is that they did a blockade of a building, but they ended up actually social distancing during it. So they ended up like actually creating a grid and staying within their grids and actually like holding rope amongst each other. So those are just some examples of like, you can actually enforce social distancing through your action design, whether that's a caravan or whether that's like taping things off, or you can do a little bit of harm reduction by actually bringing the supplies that people need on a daily basis.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Noor. This was really helpful and I hope gave folks an idea for how they can bring these skills and resources to their local communities when hosting direct actions and thinking about civil disobedience. Are there any other questions in the chat? I saw people asking if this training is going to go out, and yes, it will. If you signed up on the Zoom link, you will get an email that includes the link to this recording as well as the one from last night. But we'll allow a little bit. Oh, it looks like Maria Lee has a question. Emily, do you mind unmuting Maria?
Hi, thank you for taking the time to answer my question. So in regards to having only one police liaison in an action, I was just wondering if it might be appropriate to have an understudy for that police liaison in case they were to get arrested.
That is a good idea, especially when we're talking about actions happening in this environment, where there is a little bit like less control over your circumstances. Yeah, even though I would advise keeping one, if you're going to have an understudy or a team, just make sure that you all are in like constant communication, have some code words. I know it's old school, but walkie-talkies, we still use them. We're using them tomorrow for Juneteenth actions in DC, right? Like it would be smart to have like a backup communication system as well.
Thank you.
And it looked like Glenn Foster has their hand up.
Yeah, thank you again, Noor, for like your information and resources. It's really invaluable to have. My question for you is, I'm starting my own organization right now in DC in terms of like really reaching out and creating events that, results in like Occupy the Capitol type of events. And I want to reach out to other organizations, but I don't want to like step on other people's toes and try to like impose my events on them. So what do you think is the best course of action in being able to interact with other organizations to get that type of legitimacy that you need to get your group off the ground?
That's a really good question, Glenn. I think what I would advise doing is coming up with, like starting with the messaging and demands with your group, right? Like if you have a few different, if you have a few different like folks in your network, like coming together and thinking about what you're offering that's a value add to what you're seeing in DC right now, and then trying really hard to set up those conversations, right? There's nothing more valuable than one-to-one outreach, and sometimes like organizers are busy, right? Like if you DM them on Instagram or Twitter, they might not respond. Their email might be too busy. You want to try every avenue. Another thing that you could do is just like, this has happened to me before when I can't find someone that I really need to get in touch with. I do some research. I'm like, I'm going to go on your Facebook list. It's kind of weird. And I'm going to see if we have any mutual friends. I'm going to reach out to those mutual friends and see if they can connect me. That's what I would recommend, Glenn, is that, legitimacy takes some time, but as long as your intention and your purpose is clear and you put in the work to build those relationships, like you should be just fine. And also feel free to email me with like a little bit about your org. And I know somebody else mentioned that in the chat, so that if there's folks we can connect you with, I'd love to help you with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my strategy is always just like showing up and like being like waiting, like lingering around after something ends and kind of seeing who's like leading the stuff and going up and just having an honest conversation and being, hey, I'm trying to do XYZ. Can we get in touch? Yeah. NC has a question.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi. Hey. My question for Nora is, how are you able to protect the group or contingent against folks who would want to derail or infiltrate or disrupt the action? Do you weed them out in the registration stage, or is there something else that you do just to make sure that, you can at least lessen their presence in direct actions? Thanks.
Right. Great question, especially because I know that folks are struggling with this a little bit right now, right? It's like, if you have a direct action that involves some trainings that folks have to come to you and you're not heavily publicizing it, like then I think the like really digging into it at the registration stage makes sense, especially if you know that it's someone who you've had negative interactions with or someone who's known in the community to be disruptive. Then yes, it makes sense. But oftentimes with actions or protests, like you don't know who's going to show up, right? Like you have zero idea who's in the crowd until something happens. So in that case, what I would recommend, NC, is within your marshals having a de-escalation team and actually doing a de-escalation training where they talk through, what are the best ways to deal with someone who's in the crowd who starts like taking over the mic, or someone who goes around and tries to agitate people by saying terrible things. Like you want to make sure that you build that into your marshal team plan and into your organizer plan so everyone has the same strategy, right? Another just note on that is it also depends on what your group's decision is about how you're going to engage with the police. Unfortunately, sometimes, and this isn't something I would advise at all, but some people decide they're going to turn to the police to be that, right? However, the way to counter that is to actually learn how to do it yourself and to be able to de-escalate those situations, because we all know how to do it, right? Like if you've ever been like a middle child, right? Or like an older sibling, or like been in a classroom where an arguments happen, like you know how to do these things already. So that's what I would advise that you do, is make sure that everyone knows how to de-escalate on your team.
Great. Okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so if folks have anything they want to ask, we are 1 minute away from time. Anything else? Okay, so Noor has sent her email in the chat. It's noor@dcactionlab.com. And if you have questions for Advocates for Youth via email, you can, I guess you can shoot me an email. I'll direct you to the right person. I'll put my email in the chat. And then, yeah, if folks want to follow our social media, you can find out about the trainings that we'll be hosting in the next few weeks. And again, we are open for applications. Our applications close July 1st. And if anyone is interested in applying, please go check that out, or send it along to folks who might be interested. So again, thank you so much, Noor, and really appreciate this. Oh, Noor's muted.
Okay, awesome. I have the control over my voice back. I just want to say thank you all so much. Please don't worry about Cash Apping or Venmoing me. What I would say is give that community to some organization in your town that is throwing down for Juneteenth tomorrow, right? Like, or around the country or somewhere neighboring. So that's what I would ask for if that's something that you want to do. But I appreciate you all, and I'm so excited to see what you do. And feel free to ask me any questions, but thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.